full of the alpha's love for him, no image or sound, but a strong feeling that someone held you close to their heart and always would. Valka supposed that was how the alpha and queen structure worked for dragons. They'd form a loyal bond while they were still young. Valka had to admit that nearly physically feeling this dragon's sincere love for you would make any growing child loyal to him. She had been swayed and she was fully grown. It was heaven compared to Burke, where all the looks she received were scornful, disappointed or pitying. The alpha's love was partly why she had never considered returning to Burke. How could you face all that once you have found the perfect place for you? She wondered sometimes if she was heartless for giving up Stoic so easily, but the past was the past, and all creatures adapted, and made choices, and adapted once again. Even if the guilt would never subside entirely, the love and happiness here was enough to make her stay. The safety and security for her son made her nearly forget her previous home entirely. All around her the dragons woke as dawn filtered through the ice above them. The terror pack around her began to stir and clumsily get to their feet. A terror pack held around 10 to 20 members. If they go to 21 they would split to ensure internal fighting for resources didn't start, and they often met up regularly after the split anyway. Even within a nest family there were miniature packs and family groups, all living in harmony under the alpha's protection. Valka smiled at them and hummed with her eyes to the sky. Greetings friends, the light brings a new day. A lead terror, a queen in her own right, flopped in her lap. I cannot find the strength to let sleep go. She nuzzled Valka's leg and blinked up at her. Greetings, welcome champion. Valka smiled at her title, recalling how she had been dubbed such by the nest's king. She stroked the terror's back. Relax friend, the day is young. The terrors pottered about sleepily and picked at loose scales and rubbed against their dearest friends, socially scratching each other's backs for the loose scales they couldn't reach. Valka gently inspected the wings of the Queen Terror, but she was in impeccable condition as her pack fawned over her near constantly as she was their centerpiece in their pack. But their loyalty was entirely to their alpha. The Queen was perhaps a backup should they ever decide to leave the nest family, or go outside for an extended period, nature's backup to keep order. Even to Vikings this would make sense. When the chief falls, look to the head of the family. Valka let the little terrors inspect her in return. Normally Cloudjumper would be the one checking her for injury, illness and neatness. But as he was away Valka allowed the terrors to groom her in his place. They didn't have to do much. One nipped at her nails with his beak and another licked at some near-healed scratches, and a few young ones tried to tidy her hair and clothing. Throughout they exchanged greetings, as there was so many of them, and comments of friendship. Brief nuzzles to her limbs but not to her neck, face or chest were for her closest friends. Valka absently basked in the emotion of the alpha and the warm chatter and friendship of the terrors, and was prepared to spend the day at a slow pace until Cloudjumper returned. Some dragons were already stretching their wings and flying about, others were calling or singing in the new day, but most were still snoozing and grooming. It was all peaceful. Alpha. Valka leapt to her feet with her staff in hand yet resting against her back for balance when she heard her brother's fearful scream. She looked up and saw him fly in, swooping as fast as his forewings would allow him. She briefly breathed as she realized he was unharmed. The tight band around her heart loosened. However, she quickly lost her breath again when she saw the form of a limp dragon in his large claws. Valka's breath hitched. Fear. Denial. No, no, no. She whimpered and jumped over the cave's edge to skid down the slope towards the gathering dragons. The alpha stirred at the call of his name and opened his eyes just as Cloudjumper landed. Other dragons began to crowd to help and keen and wail for their fallen nestmate. Valka growled when she saw them blocking her way. She quickly ran up the tail of a rain cutter and nimbly jumped and ran across a floor of living scales until she reached the dragon. All the while her voice unconsciously joined the cries of the family. She fell to her knees beside the hurt dragon and began to see what she could do. She was best able to help because of her human knowledge and her human hands, which could do things claws could not. She rested her hands on the side of the limp dragon and called out comfortingly. Rest friend, Valka, Cloudjumper and the alpha are with you. The nadar beneath her hands opened one blue-green eye and coughed weakly at her. Pain. Happiness. Friend, the nadar had several arrows in her side. Valka recognized her markings and knew that this was pretty scale she with many admirers. She was not a patrol group, in fact she was barely of mating age. She must have been out when the curfew had been called, searching for potential mates, food or lost family. Valka's attention was briefly diverted when Hiccup and Toothless arrived. Hiccup slid down Cloudjumper's wing and was instantly at his mother's side. He whimpered and fretted as his hands hesitated by the arrows impaling her flanks. Fear. Sadness. Friend, you are badly hurt, I fear making it worse. Prettiscale gurgled softly and managed to move her head closer to him, though everyone could see it cost her a lot to move so limply. Hiccup, a dear friend by my side lightens my heart. Cloudjumper lowered his head and breathed hot air onto her, trying to relax her while his human sister figured out how to help. Rest. Remain still. Valka pulled out a shallow arrow and inspected the design. Her eyes burned when she saw Drago's mark on the arrow. There were many in her sides, several holes in her wings, and she had lost a lot of blood. Plus Valka could tell she had been stuck while flying, so the arrows indeed probably caused even more internal damage. She worried her bottom lip and glanced at Hiccup sadly. Worry. Sadness. Prettiscale's wounds are deep. Toothless approached and lightly licked the wound left by the arrow. He cooed and nudged Valka's arm with large pleading eyes and shifted his wings. I will help. Mother, I beg of you to keep Prettiscale from being a fallen. Valka nudged him back and began to lightly tap and pull at the arrows. Ask not, I will help. The alpha watched with concern flowing off him in waves. Hiccup barked and shrieked at the surrounding dragons, giving requests for things that would help. Some fast dragons and terrors scattered and gathered fish and herbs to try and get Prettiscale to eat and keep up her strength. Cloudjumper kept her warm with his breath, trying to soothe her pain with heat too. Toothless nudged her and encouraged her with his words, occasionally moving to clean a puncture wound. The rest of the family called out to her as once, singing songs of hope and strength. Others offered little comforts like shiny rocks and dragon nip to keep her calm. Valka noticed Stoic watching from a cliff above, but ignored him in favor of helping Prettiscale. Half the shallow arrows were safely removed when Prettiscale whimpered in agony. Valka looked at the arrow she had just removed and hissed in anger. The stone tip had been left behind. Damn it, she yelled, turning and beating her fists into the ground. Hiccup saw the arrow too and yelled in frustration. They both knew that with the sharp stone in her body her every movement would be causing her more and more harm until her wing and muscles were useless. Valka glared at the bit of wood and threw it away. Toothless spat fire at it and incinerated it. The dragons behind her were calling out in worry. Valka knew they were relying on her and Hiccup. But even if she removed the arrows, the stone would leave the muscles holding the wing to her body weak. She would never be able to fly again. The alpha breathed a soft layer of frost onto them all. Be calm. He rumbled deeply and raised his head. The stranger can help. Valka turned and saw that Stoic had approached. He was hovering uncertainly at the edge of the dragon circle. She stood warily and let Toothless take her place in comforting Prettiscale. Hiccup was distracted with wary glaring at Stoic, so was not of much comfort at the moment. Opting to be a defense. Valka grunted a few times and the dragons made a path for her. She walked through with a staff in hand until she stood before him. He looked at her wordlessly, then glanced behind her. The alpha claimed he knew something that could help. He seemed curious, not victorious over the fallen dragon. Valka sighed through her nose. She would listen to the alpha's advice, but Hiccup wasn't going to like this. Come. Underscore 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 underscore. Stoic saw Valka walk down the narrow path the dragons had made for her, her head held high and her back straight for once. Her staff was still in hand as always, and her feet were slightly twisted to one side for quick, nimble jumps or for a careful approach. Stoic wasn't sure how she managed to walk like that. It looked uncomfortable. She stood before him and examined him with her eyes. Stoic felt uncomfortable with her look and glanced behind her to try and escape her gaze. There was an adder on its belly, several arrows in its side and many dragons crowding it to care for it. Hiccup was crouched by the head, absently stroking the dragon's chin while Toothless licked at the wounds. Cloudjumper was watching closely, and his eyes flicked between watching Valka and watching the wounded dragon, making motions Hiccup and Toothless which Stoic could only assume were orders as they chirped a reply and adjusted their behavior. Valka sighed and brought his attention back to her. "Come," she ordered. She turned and walked back down the Isle of Dragons and knelt by the Nadar again. Stoic followed after a brief moment of hesitation. The dragons paid him no mind, other than to watch or sniff. They mostly looked at the wounded dragon. Valka made several calming gestures to Hiccup, who was acting skittish the closer Stoic got, but other than that she returned to examining the dragon. She looked over her shoulder when he was close enough. "She has an arrowhead stuck in her flesh. If we leave it she'll never fly again." She sounded desperate. Hiccup hesitantly crouched beside her and chirped quickly. "Pretty scale. She is hurt. Do you know how to help her?" Stoic blinked in bewilderment. "Him? Help a dragon?" He looked at Valka. "If she's hurt so bad, why not put her out of her misery?" The pair gasped. Hiccup's eyes narrowed in rage. If he had the ability to spit fire, Stoic had no doubt that he would have done that very second. He shrieked at him in bloody rage and leapt at the larger human. Valka moved fast and threw her arms around him and held him back, using a lot wrestling techniques Stoic was unfamiliar with to hold him down, shouting in dragon tongue. The entire time his animalistic eyes were fixed on Stoic. The dragons around them began to approach aggressively too. Stoic would have raised his fists to fight his way out, but the eyes of his son and the sight of his wife holding him back had rooted him to the spot. Hiccup was struggling very effectively, wrestling with his mother like an expert while his murderous eyes never left Stoic's face. Valka and Hiccup were at a clear standstill, neither gaining nor losing ground, but each stubbornly refusing to give, and fighting tooth and nail to win. Stoic didn't notice, but the king dragon had raised his head and all the surrounding dragons calmed, but it had no visible effect on Hiccup. Stoic backed off with his heart in his throat. Hiccup's eyes were bloodthirsty and full of rage. His hands, bare of claws at the moment luckily for Valka, clawed and slashed at him from his pinned position. Valka struggled with him and eventually was forced to subdue him with her staff. She collided the side of it to his temple, stunning him for a spilled second and giving her an advantage. She used her staff flat against the back of his neck to pin him down to the ground and forced her weight onto it to keep him there, keeping his legs caged with her own. Hiccup growled at her and twisted his arm in an amazing show of flexibility and dug one thumb into her wrist, making her face turn white with pain and her arm shake. She grunted in the struggle and called out for help in a wordless cry. Toothless didn't approach oddly enough. His eyes were still narrowed at Stoic, and Cloudjumper stayed away too, keeping a large wing around the Night Fury to keep him calm. All the dragons were glaring stoically, but made no move to attack or defend, and no move to help either. Help instead came from the largest dragon there. The Dragon King focused his eyes on Hiccup and rumbled so low the earth trembled with it. Stoic watched, torn between awe and horror. Hiccup stiffened and the bloodlust almost literally drained from his eyes and body. He released his mother's wrist and lay calmly, breathing in time with the giant lungs towering over them. He was immobilized. Valka slowly eased pressure off him, panting and rubbing at her abused wrist as Hiccup remained where he was. The king dragon's eyes were focused directly on Hiccup. His entire face, had it been human, would have been taunt with concentration. As it was, his teal eyes were straining and his body was utterly still. Valka raised her head to the giant and bowed slightly with a relieved sigh. Stoic was horrified. The giant dragon was somehow controlling his son. Valka sat beside Hiccup and ran a hand through his hair, murmuring and cooing as if to a startled deer. Hiccup didn't look like he was fighting it, and for a moment Stoic wished he would break free and attack him, anything than being bent to the dragon's will. But he was calm, but at the cost of the king's entire attention. Toothless approached at last, looking calm and docile with his large eyes once more. He nudged Hiccup's head gently and softly vumped at him. Hiccup's eyes focused on Toothless, inhumanly slow and empty, still immobilized for now, and he whimpered at Toothless, sounding upset the moment he recognized him. Tears built in the corners of his eyes and he tried to bury his head into the earth in shame. Toothless nuzzled his face and carefully got his head under Hiccup's chest to have him rest against his scaly head. Hiccup relaxed at his friend's low humming and the humming of the alpha slowly receded. Hiccup was released from that terrifying control. Hiccup's arms finally came up around Toothless' head, with his own forehead buried against the black scales. With the humming gone, so was the paralysis. His teeth were grit and tears streamed from his eyes as he shook. Toothless cooed and occasionally licked at Hiccup's chest and chin, nudging him with the affection of a cat and the love, understanding and forgiveness of something more than human. Valka rubbed his back and whispered to him in clicks and shushs as Toothless calmed Hiccup down. Toothless's presence was most effective, Stoic realized. He was quickly confused as to why Valka wasn't the main source of comfort. Was a dragon that special to him? It took place over his own parent. Hiccup raised his teary face, still looking sad, and nuzzled Toothless' nose a final time before turning and hugging his mother, sobbing a little more and quietly gasping and wailing. Valka smiled and patted his back, murmuring gently and nuzzling his nose before kissing his forehead. The distraught boy weakly smiled at her, then he held the hand he had caused pain to, and pressed it warmly between his palms. His head hung low as he whispered and sighed an apology through hitched breaths. Valka kissed his forehead once again and murmured back, brushing at his wild hair reassuringly, forgiving him for his burst of rage. She put a hand below his chin and made him look up at her. She looked proud and calm as the same hand lowered to his chest and pressed briefly, just hard enough to make his body slightly move with the force. Hiccup smiled very slightly and covered her hand, murmuring so quietly it was only through watching his trembling lips you could tell he was speaking. Valka smiled, the corners of her eyes wrinkling, and she nuzzled his hair and ears affectionately. Stoic was still shocked at how she had so easily let the Dragon King's control over her son pass so easily. That beast had rendered Hiccup immobile, a blank, compliant doll of his usual self, the angry, ever-moving, curious and strange young man who acted like a boy and a dragon. The beast had controlled him. How could Valka let that go? Was this beast really forcing them to stay here and making them think otherwise? Could that happen to him? Stoic was chilled at the thought and almost raised his fists again. Hiccup got to his feet and walked ashamed to the Dragon King's face. He swept his arms before him in a wingless bow and his breath hitched in a sob as he croaked and crooned what was clearly an apology to the mighty beast. He was paying homage to the giant like flattering a wronged man with gifts. Stoic didn't know why he was apologizing. Hiccup should hate that creature. Look at what it was doing to him, what it could make him do. The Dragon King rumbled and breathed a soft sheet of frost over Hiccup's head. His eyes were kind. Hiccup raised his head, looking a little surprised, before drying his eyes on his wrists and smiling at the larger dragon, chittering softly. The Dragon King blinked his eyes slowly and hummed lowly once again. Hiccup glanced away, embarrassed. But then both looked back at the injured dragon, who was quietly watching. Valka sighed and got to her feet with a proud expression. The situation had been resolved. She turned back to Stoic with her face instantly turning hard. She lost all her emotions and showed a side as hard as dragon scales. Any more suggestions? She asked through a hiss. Somehow she managed to sound more threatening in Norse than when she was screeching and howling. Stoic weakly looked at the wounded dragon, Hiccup, his wife and the larger dragon still not over that display of will so strong it had left Hiccup immobile. Hiccup seemed himself now, his sharp green eyes piercing him more effectively than any arrowhead, and he quickly had come back to the shadow that always followed him, peering out from under an extended wing. Stoic cleared his throat slightly and offered a human treatment, once he had seen a healer do to save a wrist. Have you got any tweezers? Or something that grips? He made motions to be sure they understood. Hiccup answered. Teeth. He bared them as he said so. Stoic made a face. Not the best choice. You can reach in a drawer out the stone, he explained to his wife. The healers let it bleed until the stone is visible and then pull it out. Hiccup and Valka's eyes lit up. Hiccup chattered excitedly and leapt over the wounded dragon to inspect the wound. All around the dragons watched with hopeful expressions. Hiccup put on a clawed glove and carefully poked the wound for the stone. When he found it he tried to grip it. The dragon jerked in pain a few times and whimpered a clear protest. Hiccup moaned an apology and nuzzled her wings before he exchanged his hand for his teeth and sucked out the blood, turning his face to spit it out before returning to attempt to grip at the rock. The dragon lay still and did not complain further. Stoic felt a little nauseous at the sight of Hiccup getting a mouthful of dragon blood, and the blood all over his chin and mouth. He looked savage. His green eyes burned in determination, and his dark clothes littered with dragon scales, a clawed hand, Dark brownish-reddish hair and blood on his face made him look that much more terrifying. There was no Viking behavior in that at all, not even humans willingly sucked out another's blood, nor did they touch another's blood in general if they could help it. The redness stained Hiccup's teeth, he looked more like a mad animal. Valka returned to his side almost unnoticed by all, watching with anticipation. Her staff tilted slightly in her hand, making it rattle and produce noises like the grumbles of the watching dragons. Hiccup repeated his actions for a short minute before pulling back with the rock between his front teeth. He spat it out and roared briefly in victory. Valka let out a primal cheer along with the crowds behind her, her arms came up to wrap around Hiccup in a moment of pure joy. Hiccup returned the gesture just as fiercely. The dragons stomped their feet and flapped their wings, bumped their neighbors and let out tongues of flame, a celebration like a Viking's when a warrior pulled through deathly circumstances. Hiccup didn't bother cleaning his face, he began to work another arrow loose while Toothless lapped the wound clean. Valka sat by the dragon's head and both the Dragon King and Cloudjumper moved closer to her while she communicated with the wounded dragon. Cloudjumper had one small wing extended and wrapped around Valka's side, she leaned on it in turn. They both took turns to make noises in dragon tongue, accompanied by a long, complex series of gestures and expressions. The wounded dragon let out several mournful sounds as they spoke. Valka often had to rub her nose and jaw, like soothing an anxious child by stroking their hair, especially when the dragon was reduced to meaningless wails of misery. Even Stoic could hear the loss in the dragon's howls. The Ice King had closed his eyes, looking saddened by whatever he was learning from the three. All had forgotten about Stoic. Stoic alternated between watching his wife, to watching his son. Hiccup had removed all the arrows and was patiently pressing the pads of his fingers around the scales of the wounds, making the slowing and thickening blood fill the puncture wounds to seal them. Toothless did the sealing with his saliva, and occasionally turning to clean Hiccup's face of some of the blood. Hiccup didn't complain about the tongue that swept over his face, nor did he make a face of disgust like Stoic, he acted as if it wasn't happening, too focused on the task at hand sealing the wounds. Finally he sat back and relaxed, looking weary. Toothless curled around him and they settled to rest, Hiccup looking proud but sad. Toothless nudged him a few times and convinced Hiccup to curl up against his side like Hiccup was a kitten in the cradle of a larger cat. They dozed. But Stoic knew they weren't sleeping, Toothless' ears kept twitching and Hiccup was absently twisting a claw through a clump of grass by his head. Stoic glanced around and realized that most of the dragons that had crowded before had dispersed. Mainly Nadars remained, though one or two terrible terror groups hovered around with fish in their mouths and grass in their claws. Valka accepted the fish and the grass and carefully made a temporary nest out of the grass for the dragon's head. The dragon relaxed and almost went to sleep with it, the fish she ate lazily. Cloudjumper lowered his larger head and carefully nudged her into a comfortable sleeping position, using his free inner wing a little like an arm when she struggled. Valka helped too, stroking her wings and neck and tucking in the plucked grass around her as she shifted. Once the dragon had settled, Valka kissed her nose and reached under her chin to lightly scratch. The Nadar's eyes widened in surprise, with an odd-sounding croak, before rolling back unconscious. Hiccup raised his head at the noise, but quickly returned to doodling in the dirt when he saw nothing amiss. Once again, the moment Hiccup had tensed, Toothless' head rose to scan for danger, he relaxed as Hiccup did and went back to listening. His ears twitched that much more attentively afterwards. Valka sat with one hand on her staff, it leaning against her shoulder and tucked neatly at the top of Cloudjumper's inner right wing, and her left hand at her chin, a habit she had always had. Clearly she was thinking deeply. Stoic cleared his throat a few times to get her attention, no way in hell would he approach 4 large dragons. Even if his family was with them. But he had to speak with them. Valka raised her head after the third attempt on Stoic's part. She looked a little annoyed at the interruption to her thoughts. Hiccup sent an irritated glare that matched Toothless, they moved at the same time, with identical tolerance levels for unnecessary noise. Both had sharp looks in their eyes, but they soon relaxed when they saw Valka stand to greet him, or deal with him. Valka stood up and faced him, not moving from her place so there was at least a 3-meter space between them. She nodded briefly. Thank you, Stoic. Your suggestion will now save Prettiscale her flight. She gazed down at the hurt dragon, some of the other Nadars now settling around her. Poor girl, she sighed, she has lost her entire family. She says she was attacked shortly before dawn by a ship with black sails. She is only just an adult, younger than Hiccup. She had knelt once again to rub at her nose. Stoic listened uncertainly. He was not used to hearing such things. A dragon with a family, a dragon an orphan, a dragon which he had saved from going lame. Stoic rubbed at his forehead. The world was tilting faster and faster and he was struggling to find a grip on the new landscape. Things which were once so wrong were now being done of his own free will. How low had his Viking status fallen? He looked up and saw that Hiccup had joined his mother, standing by her side with Toothless at his back, level with his shoulder. Valka and Hiccup exchanged a small glance, Valka tilting her head towards Stoic with an encouraging expression. Hiccup looked down at his fist and then raised his head and walked a few paces forwards. He looked into Stoic's eyes with the defiant eyes of youth, and of dragons, but then his closed expression softened slightly. He opened his palm and held it out to Stoic. Stoic approached and saw that Hiccup was holding the broken arrowhead. The stone was sharp, and crudely cut for extra damage. It would have certainly sliced any muscle that so much as tensed around it. It being embedded next to a wing joint would have done serious damage. He looked up into Hiccup's eyes and saw the young man meeting him with a slightly wary but mostly grateful and respectful expression. Though there was still a hint of defiance, the type found on those as free as the wind and seas, Stoic thought it suited him. Hiccup curled his hand back around the arrow and spoke clearly. She will recover now. Thank you. Stoic blinked a few times. His thoughts of wrong and UN Viking shut up as it earned him his son's respect. Stoic reached a hand out instinctively to place on his shoulder. Hiccup was just in range for that. But the young man tensed and skittered back a few paces on light and silent feet. His face wary once again. Stoic lowered his hand and nodded, hating the space between them, but glad that Hiccup was willing to lessen the distance one step at a time. Hiccup's face fell into something a little darker as he dropped the arrowhead. You've killed thousands of them. Don't ever hurt a dragon. His fist rose and thumped his chest. My family, in front of me. Don't even speak of it in front of me. His eyes were steely. I will not hold back, he promised, his green eyes unwavering. Stoic swallowed slightly, unnerved all over again, but at least the fiery rage was contained this time. Then he found reason to chuckle slightly. Here was his fishbone of a son saying he would take him out. Stoic put his fists to his hips and shook his head. I doubt you could take me on, son. You're many things, but a wrestler is not one of them, he chuckled. Hiccup merely raised an eyebrow and called out in dragon tongue to the group behind him. Valka laughed, scorn mixed with amusement. She walked forwards, Cloudjumper climbing the cliff to look down on them and Toothless slinking up behind her as if wary of interrupting. Valka rested a hand on Hiccup's shoulder. Hiccup, she began. Hiccup turned to face her, his face lighting up a little when he met her gaze. Stoic could tell they were close. He was pained that he wasn't included. Valka's face danced between laughter and a large grin. He doubts you because of your size, she explained. Hiccup's face morphed into complete surprise before he threw back his head in a full-blow cackle. Toothless began to laugh too, an odd string of barks, snorts and groaning hiccups that made up his amusement. To Stoic's embarrassment, even the Nadars appeared to be snickering. Cloudjumper had his eyes half closed in clear restraint to stop hooting too. Valka cooed something in Hiccup's ear and he quickly nodded, nearly jumping in eagerness as he and Toothless flew up into the air at Valka's suggestion. Valka turned to Stoic with a confident expression. Don't underestimate him because he's not a Viking. Stoic, she grinned and flipped her staff in her hand absently, the opposite end now resting on the ground. If I hadn't have stopped him before, you would have been taken apart, she smirked, obviously confident and proud of him. But that declaration brought back the scene in which Hiccup had become a mindless animal of rage, most importantly how that rage had been dispelled. Stoic sobered instantly. He looked, nearly glared, at the large white dragon who was apparently dozing whilst towering over the cluster of Nadars. Stoic looked back at his wife and tried not to burst into a fully accusing state. What happened to Hiccup? He asked, not willing to admit he was growling. Valka responded to his rise in aggression with a few body shifts for defense and a rise in her own anger. Her green eyes narrowed and her head tilted higher, trying to appear bigger, stronger, and intimidate him. Instinctual but animalistic. She tightened her hands on her staff. You send him over the edge, she bit back. How would you feel if I suggested beheading one of your trainees to save their suffering? Especially when there are other options, she demanded, growling and shifting in place. Stoic glared off to one side, ignoring her question because he knew she was right, but he didn't want to acknowledge it. What did that beast do to him? Valka's knuckles were white. The Alpha stopped him from ripping your throat out. She spoke as if he should be grateful. Stoic glared. By doing what? He roared. What in the name of hell was that thing doing to him? Valka growled under her breath. The Alpha's power is within the mind. He is too large to physically intervene with the smaller dragons of his nest, his family. But he can quell their anger and gather us to his side with a mere thought echoing in our minds. Stoic paled. He controls you. Valka shook her head, still looking frustrated. He would never, she protested, glancing back at him with an awed expression. Not unless it was for our own good. Preventing a destructive anger is stopping Hiccup from ruining the point of you being here. The Alpha protects them all, she finished, her expression that of a worshipper before her deity. Stoic wasn't listening. You're his slaves. Valka glared at him once again. Are you deaf? She snapped. Not even a dragon as powerful as our Alpha can control every dragon here every second of the day. She tossed her head and hair with unmistakable pride. He touches our thoughts, shares memories, sheds light through clouded minds, and sees every part of the nest through the eyes of his family. But if he truly tried to control us against our will, then we would fight him, then those with enough will and bonds to others would be able to leave. Only the weakest and loneliest would be slaves to an aggressive Alpha. Valka hesitated before speaking onwards. However, it is true that when an Alpha gives a command, the dragons have little choice but to follow, but our Alpha has learned that kindness makes a healthy nest. Enslavement will lead to abandonment by his nest. Valka mentally sighed to herself. Stoic just had to pick the point hardest to explain. Why would anyone go to or stay with a leader who was cruel? The only exceptions were Imran. When an Alpha or Queen brainwashed them so thoroughly that they forgot their own names and only existed for their leader's beck and call. However, even then it was relatively easy for some dragons to escape because the more dragons there were, the more spread the leader's attention was. Some could slip through the cracks. The exceptions for Drago was that the dragons which followed him were the ones who accepted his tyranny. Those who resisted were killed. In the case of the evil queen, she exploited the dragon's bond, always keeping a member of their smaller packs within her reach for ransom. It was rare that she accidentally let a group of dragons out who had the capacity to run away forever. In their Alpha's case, he earned and won their loyalty through kindness, wisdom, love, and no small amount of impress. Plus the fact he could keep such a large nest healthy and happy was testament to his generosity and had wrapped Valka's loyalty in iron bands. She would gladly give her last breath in his defense and would follow his every order, as she knew he had chosen the decision best for the entire nest. But Stoic could never see him that way. Stoic glared at the beast once again. Can he do that to me? He grumbled. Valka laughed and shook her head. No. You're not as open-minded to hear him, she criticized. She boastfully stood tall. I can. But it took a lot of practice and listening. Hiccup can hear him naturally. He's heard the Alpha's voice ever since he was a babe. She turned with wonder in her eyes. I can only imagine what wonders he has seen through the Alpha's thoughts. Stoic grunted. But Hiccup's not a dragon, he protested. How can that beast control him? Valka smirked lightly. Because Hiccup thinks like a dragon, she said as a way of explaining everything. I'm too human, it's harder for him to influence me. Hiccup's a little easier, but as you saw, it takes all the Alpha's concentration plus a distraction to actually get Hiccup to listen to him. She raised a hand at Stoic's sharp glance. But you are correct, Hiccup is human, so the Alpha's influence over him is very small compared to the dragons we live with. If Hiccup focused, he could have overcome the command to stop attacking you. But I stopped him, and Toothless returned him to his senses. Stoic huffed. It's still not right, he insisted. Valka raised an eyebrow. It's no different than your methods of bullying and peer pressure to get your Vikings to quit causing a riot, she snapped. Stoic thought about it briefly. To be bullied or pressured into something wasn't pleasant nor what you wanted, though often for the victim's own good, as it was his role as chief to keep bloodshed at bay. Was the larger dragon's power any less useful or any different? Stoic stubbornly insisted that it was, but inside he was less than sure. Valka, and her all-knowing eyes, seemed to see his inner conflict and relaxed slightly. She looked up at Cloudjumper and whistled. Cloudjumper turned his great head upwards towards the mountain and he exhaled long through his nose, causing his nose to vibrate with a strangely unique hum. Valka smiled and turned to Stoic. "Come, we have something to show you," she ordered cryptically, and stealthily walked to the cliff front where Cloudjumper lowered a hooked wing and grasped her hooked staff with it. He pulled her up and they waited patiently for Stoic to follow. Stoic did, of course, curiosity eating at him. He noticed that, though Valka had her back turned to her dragon and Cloudjumper was looking elsewhere, they were speaking intensely. Noises faster and in high variety passed between them, with the extra thumps of tails and staffs adding to the mix. Stoic wondered what they could be saying. When he joined them, Valka led the way once again and Cloudjumper circled overhead. Stoic glanced up at the dragon a few times, still feeling a little grudge, but now just looking at him. He was a rarer breed, not one of the locals who raided Berk, and he looked full-grown. His wings made him an expert at flying, and with his decorative tail he seemed to swoop and slice through the air. He cleared his throat slightly. "What type is he?" he asked his wife. Valka glanced up. "In dragon tongue his breed is four-wing twisting neck." She chuckled at Stoic's confused expression. "But I've nicknamed his kind Stoacutter, after the way he flew with me and Hiccup on our first arrival. He's a bit far north for his kind, but he likes it here, so he stays." Stoic looked at the large beast and grunted. Stoacutter it would do. He'd sooner name it Demon or Hell's Pet, but he daren't voice that aloud. Valka led him to a large hollow, a cove of sorts that was filled with a shallow layer of sand and had many ridges for dragons to perch on. It reminded him slightly of the kill ring at home, but there was no lingering smell of death here, and there were ferns and moss growing on every surface with a few bare patches due to scales and claws. Hiccup was conversing with a monstrous nightmare, a Ziplyback, a terrible Terrapack, a Gronkle, and a Nadar. Toothless was cooing at his shoulder, Hiccup crouching and leaning against the reptile's leg as they spoke. As the two humans approached, Toothless and the other dragons looked at them. Hiccup followed their gaze and nodded his head towards them slightly. Valka beamed radiantly and laughed, gesturing to the shallow cove and clicking and hooting with her chest puffing in pride. Hiccup snickered, rubbed his left side along Toothless' neck as a farewell, and let Toothless lick at his face one more time before he slid into the cove of sand. Valka took a seat, Cloudjumper curling around her perfectly. She leaned against his wing and propped her feet up on his tail, her staff across her legs. Cloudjumper's largest wing acted as a pillow while his smallest was her leaning mattress. He looked comfortable as he rested his head near Valka, his eyes tracking the gathering dragons. Stoic sat awkwardly a foot or so away from the both of them. He wasn't sure what to do with himself when his wife acted so calm and at ease around these beasts. They were what parted them, and they still were causing barriers. Stoic tensed when several dragons landed a bit too near to him for his liking. He wished he had his hammer. "What's going on?" he asked at last, interrupting Valka's absent picking of loose scales off Cloudjumper's wing. Valka looked up and smirked. "Hiccup is going to prove that he can take care of himself. That his size doesn't matter and that he's more than a match for you, Stoic." She tilted her head as Cloudjumper absently nuzzled her tied hair, using his teeth delicately to brush back her hair. She smiled fondly and patted his nose. She gestured to Hiccup, who was preparing for his spa. "Need I remind you that Hiccup's wrestled with dragons?" Stoic gulped when he saw Hiccup remove his gloves and toss them to one side, defenseless. He was so small compared to the scaly beasts. Hell, he was small compared to a normal Viking. How would he stand a chance against their fire or claws? Stoic glanced at Toothless and saw the beast relaxed, almost looking bored, as it stretched over a rock like a cat. His green eyes tracked Hiccup constantly, but he made no protest to Hiccup's loss of weapons. Valka sensed his anxiousness and spoke soothingly. "The rules are no injuries or burns, and the victor is the first to submit. Pinning, and/or exhausting the opponent until they give or until the watchers deem you beaten." She ran a hand across Cloudjumper's nose. "But these dragons would never hurt Hiccup," she whispered, concrete in her faith. Underscore 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 underscore. underscore 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 underscore. Stoic was relieved to see Hiccup only facing the small terror pack. The little dragons jumped, crawled and flew down to the pit and began to mill about as Hiccup stretched. They spoke though, in chirps and gurgles, as they scuttled like rats in Stoic's eyes. Their awkward walking gaits and huge eyes made them look almost harmless and puppy-like. Stoic knew otherwise. A mob attack by these creatures could take out a full-grown prize yak. But he was glad Hiccup was only fighting these small dragons. Stoic knew how those dragons fought, and had knocked many a flying rat out of the sky before. He sized Hiccup up against the tiny dragons and found himself smiling slightly as the odds weighed in Hiccup's favor. All he had to do was be fast, forceful and precise. Although Hiccup was outnumbered, the pesky dragons could easily be knocked out with a punch or kick. With a hammer, he could take out more than one at a time. Maybe he would use the rocks laying around to hurtle at the scaly beasts. Stoic began to strategize in the ways of Vikings. He pictured a whole fluid battle with his son triumphing and standing tall above a pile of beaten dragons, so was surprised when Hiccup lowered himself into a crouch like a tightly coiled spring. After blinking in confusion for a while, he realized he shouldn't have expected anything Viking-like. Valka wasn't a good fighter when she lived on Berk, so how could she had taught Hiccup Viking self-defense? How could Hiccup be better than a bad teacher? He sighed to himself. He shouldn't have expected a Viking fight in a dragon's den. Nevertheless, seeing Hiccup stalking like a circling wolf, teeth bared and hands clawed, was a bit unexpected. Stoic vaguely recalled what it was like to be on the receiving end of Hiccup's prowl. When he was set down for the first time in the dragon caves, it certainly counted as intimidation. His uncovered face revealed quick eyes and a face set in determination. His eyes never stayed on one dragon for long, too many to keep track of, but they lingered just long enough to code and break down their stances. Stoic counted about 11 terrors as they shifted and moved. Hiccup dug one foot into the sand and barked at them sharply, raising as high as he could within his crouch and raising his arms and shoulders like dragon wings to make himself look bigger. They hissed and gurgled back and began to slink about in a stalking manner, with Hiccup as prey. Stoic tensed. He had seen this behavior before, and many a man had received heavy burns and flayings from these dragons' mob attacks. The little beasts approached from all sides, and Hiccup twisted and turned and backed up, trying to keep himself from being surrounded by the pesky pests. His face was a mask of concentration and his fingers twitched even as he slid into a fighter's stance, every muscle tensed to act the moment they moved. His eyes still flicked from one to the next, not settling on a target and not moving to strike. Stoic silently praised his way of thinking. To charge a pack at one point would only open up your sides and back to the rest. After a minute of sizing each other up, the pack all moved at once on an unspoken signal and mobbed the young man. Hiccup ducked but found himself covered in the scaly creatures. There were too many to dodge. They clambered on his back, pulled at his clothes and hair, and wrapped arms and legs around his limbs to weight him down. The others flew around his head, mocking him. Stoic frowned. He seemed truly beaten. If Hiccup could be beaten by half a terror pack, then how was he a good fighter? This was counterproductive to what Valka was saying. Hiccup roared in frustration and quickly rolled on the ground, seizing one dragon in each hand and pressing his thumbs under their chins. The dragons jumped briefly off to avoid being flattened, but the two he held suddenly went limp. Hiccup dropped them and moved in a series of rolls, jumps and awkward flips and twists to try and keep the rest of the mob from incapacitating him. Stoic's eyes were wide as Hiccup's never-ending series of movements. Although none of it was Viking-like, there was a certain grace in how he moved around the area. He was well practiced in agility. It echoed the fluid motions of the dragons. The terrors aimed for Hiccup's neck and his hands, some even tried to trip him, and succeeded often. They were wearing him down with sheer numbers. Valka and Cloudjumper, and the other watching dragons appeared to be cheering them on in the forms of roars, other dragons appearing to watch too. Hiccup took them out one at a time until the 7 that were left changed tactics and began to fly above him and mob him in 2s and 3s, distracting while one round into his back or his knees to try and trip him. Hiccup protected his neck and shoulders expertly, twisting unnaturally and regaining his balance like a contortionist as he was shoved and pushed. Hiccup began to grin as they passed, the embodiment of growing confidence, and managed to snatch one or two of the little terrors and rendered them useless like their fellow pack members with either a stroke under their beaked chin or a flutter of his fingers above their bulging eyes. When there was only 3 left they let Hiccup chase them and scurried about to wear him out, but that was below Hiccup's abilities. They hid and zipped and flew high above reach, but Hiccup was not fazed. At this point Stoic would have lifted a rock or something to throw at them to knock them down. But he realized that Hiccup would not do such a thing, it wasn't his style and the rock would likely break a few wing bones. Why would Hiccup hurt a dragon he considered an ally? Hiccup's face lit up with a small idea. He spun around, scooped up a handful of sand, and threw the sand at them when he was in range. His throws were excellent, Stoic observed, the aim was impeccable and he had taken environment factors into account. Stoic saw each throw hit its target, it never missed. On Burke he would make a fine dagger thrower, or maybe an archer. The sand got into the eyes or mouths of the terrors. They were helpless as they squawked in surprise, and while they sneezed or blinked the sand away Hiccup caught them and tickled them into submission. Their squawks turning into squeals and wriggles in Hiccup's arms. The young man was grinning, his face lit up in mischief as he playfully tormented the brightly colored pests. Valka laughed and raised her staff, declaring the winner along with several other dragons who spread their wings wide to welcome a victory. The other observers celebrated Hiccup's win with jumps, wing beats, roars and tongues of flame. Hiccup smiled up at his mother, looking like a boy playing with puppies than a young man who had just bested a pack of terrible terrors. Stoic was quite impressed to say the least. Even against one his trainees were struggling, even when the terror's shots were used up. Hiccup had taken on 11. His fluid, and slightly awkward movements made far better progress compared to the Vikings' strong stand and take-it stances. His dodging was good, slightly useless against so many opponents, but Stoic saw the potential against smaller numbers. Hiccup had stood up, outfired, outnumbered, but very obviously not outmatched. Even in Viking ways Stoic saw several strong aspects to his fighting techniques. He had high stamina, outstanding aim, and moved lightning fast when the moment called for it. His alternate gifts, his dodging, agility, his brains and grace were still highly useful. Even Stoic, as conservative as he was, acknowledged Hiccup's prowess as a strong opponent in a fight, brawl or battle. If he was judged by Vikings his victory wouldn't have counted for much, however in a war and not a match his skills were welcomed if they kept him alive. Valka turned her bright smile to him. What do you think? She asked, proud, smug and amused. Stoic nodded slowly. He can definitely hold his own against pests, he agreed, not willing to voice too much too soon. There's definitely more than meets the eye. His aim is good, he added, unable to resist complimenting his son. Valka chuckled and smiled as Hiccup began to chat with the rousing terrors. He has Toothless to thank for that. A night fury never misses, and he passed the little secrets and instincts on to Hiccup. When he was a boy he could hit a sparrow with a pebble from 10 feet. She recalled, her tone was boastful, and full of a parent's pride. Stoic was jealous of her privilege, she had seen him grow and taught him to become better. What he wouldn't give to have that chance himself. He made to stand and Valka turned in almost alarm. Stoic. Where are you going? She asked, sounding startled. Stoic froze halfway standing. He's proven his point, hasn't he? Valka laughed and her grin returned, she gestured back to his seat. Sit down. You've seen nothing yet. Both her and her dragon were back to intensely watching Hiccup. Stoic retook his seat warily. Once the little critters recovered they all crowded Hiccup for nuzzles and pets, all gurgling to him in a mess of noise, maybe thanking him for the spa. Then, with another unseen signal, they all dispersed at once. They flew to some ferns and settled to watch, piling over each other like a litter of pups. Hiccup stood up and rode up to the ranks of dragons watching, pacing around and looking his audience in the eye as he stood tall and flexed his body into several intimidating poses. Even Stoic recognized the note of challenge within his voice. He was instantly re-interested, there was going to be another match. Hiccup stomped, and partly strutted, around the cove and kept voicing his demand for another match. His animalistic calls sending chills down Stoic's spine while also speeding up his heart in an off mixture of anticipation. About 5 calls after the first a dragon answered, a gronkle. Stoic instinctively knew that this dragon would be defeated easily if he took out the wings with a sharp blade. Then a few strong axe hits to the neck would wear the skin down enough to draw blood, then it was just a matter of following through to behead it. However, his tactics were quickly forgotten once again when Hiccup burst into a crouching sprint, leaping and rolling over the rocky environment like a leaf in the wind. Hiccup ran circles around the slow-moving dragon, literally. He was faster in taking down the boulder-class dragon, noticeably. After tricking the beast into using all its shots, Stoic had his heart in his mouth for every blast. They were too close to Hiccup's body. Never mind the confidence he used as he ducked and danced around the bites, claws and flames of the larger being, it was a hands-down victory for Hiccup. He had speed and agility over the dragon's strength and flying and firepower. He moved like smoke through and around the dragon's attacks, untouchable. Once it was totally safe for Hiccup to get close, victory was achieved in seconds. A quick jab under the creature's jaw had it dumbly purring on the floor, looking rather dazed and compliant. Valka threw her head back in a roaring howl of amusement, followed by toothless own humps of hilarity. The dragons all anonymously named Hiccup the winner once again, more adding their opinions this time. Hiccup just smiled and sat before the dragon with his face close to its yellow eyes. He chirped a few times at it and patted its rocky chin to rouse it from its daze. The moment the Gronkle woke up, it pushed its massive head into Hiccup's lap and playfully nibbled at his chest, its stumpy tail waggling so its whole body felt it. Hiccup shoved it off with a good-natured whine, but indulged in a brief scratching of the creature's jaw nonetheless. It was an odd ritual, Stoic observed, to cuddle and play with your opponent after one was declared better than the other. However, he remembered often extending a hand to a fallen friend after a friendly fight. Perhaps these rituals of affection were merely an extended hand. Dragons and Hiccup had no obvious restrictions to hiding their impulses and emotions. If Stoic had no reputation or rank, and was better in tune and honest with his feelings, he may have been a bit more chummy with his old sparing friends too. Valka raised a hand to silently tell Stoic to stay, but he had given up moving, he was too interested. However, Stoic could barely watch the next fight. The challenger was a Nadar with yellow and grey scales and brown eyes. He gave up offering any mental strategies since Hiccup played by his own rules. But he nearly intervened when the beast struck several spines at Hiccup, pinning him in place. It was only a minute into the match. So far it had consisted of a dance of agility and limb swinging that, had they been human, must have been the equivalent of throwing a few experimental punches to test the strengths of the opponent. Their tails and fists never landed a hit in the beginning. But then the Nadar charged, forcing Hiccup to dive into a corner to avoid the broad attack. His face teetered between horrified and annoyed as he realized he was cornered. He moved to get back into the open, but then the spines had fired, leaving Hiccup pinned in the ground, spread-eagled by his arms. Toothless growled and roared encouragement. Hiccup yelled in frustration and got free with an over-the-shoulder roll that looked a little painful for his muscles. He had to get the momentum out of nowhere and have the strength to drag his weight through. He pulled one arm free and dodged the charge and teeth that came at him by ducking under the jaw and kicking at the Nadar's leg, causing it to stumble and face-plant into the wall behind them. Stoic had his heart in his mouth at that point. Those teeth were too close. Valka was tense and muttering constantly. Cloudjumper was still as stone, not even his fans were moving. Toothless was still intensely watching, his claws had absently gripped the earth for a quick intervention should it be needed. Hiccup let out a snort of amusement when he saw the Nadar with its face against the rocks, and pulled his other arm free with a grunt. He ran back into the open space and he began to dance in front of the recovered Nadar, hiding in the blind spot and looking like he was taunting the blue and green dragon. His face was a light of mischief, even when the dragon tried breathing fire at him. Toothless' face was amused as well, as amused as a dragon could look, and both Cloudjumper and Valka had relaxed too. It went on for a long time, and the Nadar got more aggressive as Hiccup ghosted about, untouchable. Stoic began to watch Hiccup more carefully. He could see that young man was literally predicting when and how the Nadar was going to breathe fire or use its spines. With his unnatural predicting skills, he was already moving out of the way of the next attack. Stoic absently wondered if Hiccup was reading the beast much like he had read himself. He had somehow known of his troubled thoughts when he had briefly spoken to him while hanging from the cliff above his temporary home. He had said nothing, but somehow Hiccup still got the entire story out of him through merely being in his silent presence. Soon Valka was clearing her throat at him, silently scolding him for drawing out the match. Hiccup huffed at her noise, but it prompted him to slide beneath the dragon's jaw and scratch several spots in quick succession. The dragon promptly flopped with a startled croak. Hiccup slowed his skid to a halt and calmly crossed his legs and held his ankles innocently, as if he hadn't just knocked out a beast several times bigger and strong than himself. As if he hadn't been running circles around the beast like a fox around a chicken. Valka rolled her eyes while Stoic struggled to pick up his jaw again. Valka raised her voice to her son and made several sharp gestures. She appeared to be reprimanding Hiccup as she pointed down at him, Cloudjumper adding his own grunts and fluttering crests to the lecture, making himself bigger to impose his opinions. Hiccup kept grinning, though he cringed a few times and whined once at their stern tones. But those moments passed quickly and he was back to patiently waiting for the Nadar to move. He hummed what sounded a bit tuneful as the beast snoozed. The Nadar had shoved him over in revenge, making Hiccup roll his eyes in a very Valka way, one that Stoic had received often when he was younger, and acting foolishly both Valka and Cloudjumper let out their own noises of amusement too, exchanging a look like old friends. Hiccup whimpered, sounding remorseful as the Nadar stomped away. Hiccup got up and approached on silent, stealthy feet, well in the beast's sights, and reached forwards to stroke the spines on the beast's tail. After a moment of it shivering and being stubborn, Hiccup had won its affections back. They playfully knocked heads a few times before the Nadar flew away. Hiccup's next challenger was a purple and brown Zipleeback. The hideous Zipleeback he won by confusing it, jumping on its back and around its necks, making it impossible for it to get a strike in. Stoic nearly laughed and cheered along with the dragons as Hiccup performed. Hiccup used its neck supples and twisted his body around them like a silk flag. He tied up the necks and sat on them until they granted submission. Each head was pointed in the other direction and his hands waved over their faces time and again, doing something to their eyes, and sending them back into weak dazes so he didn't get thrown off. But eventually it gave up. It hadn't even had a chance to fire. Hiccup kept kicking their heads away from the gas, and pressing his wrists into their throats in a way that made them cough out nothing but air closing off the gas gland or smothering the sparking mechanism. In the aftermath, one head nuzzled Hiccup kindly and the other roughly bumped him. Hiccup head-butted the second head back with a large grin and absently patted the first head. Valka quickly whispered to Stoic that the heads had their own personalities, one was a little more prideful than the other. Stoic felt his own pride grow at Hiccup's prowess in the ring. If Hiccup was showing anything, it was that size really wasn't a restriction. The larger they go, the easier it seemed to be for Hiccup. Was it larger targets? Or was it that he had more practice with the more intimidating breeds? Stoic hoped that both were so, because it was now the turn of the monstrous nightmare. Stoic gulped when he saw the large orange and red creature skulk down into the cove. Hiccup was a pipsqueak compared to this beast. He was barely the size of its jaw. Hiccup didn't look scared, but it did nothing for Stoic's nerves as the dragon stood beside him with teeth, claws and smoke trailing from its maw. Stoic's hands were fists as they circled each other like wolves. There was an odd tension which wasn't there before as they sized each other up. Hiccup visibly hesitated once before resuming his prowl. Valka must have sensed a change too. She and her dragon shifted slightly to be more attentive. Toothless' tail was no longer absently swaying. Stoic glanced at her for an explanation. Valka helplessly gestured before she found the words. "This is a dragon from the war, we rescued him only a few months ago. He's still accustomed to fighting." Cloudjumper let out a growl that steadily lowered, a warning. His tail tapped the earth as it twitched and his shoulder rolled. "He may not be gentle." Valka translated. Hiccup's side steps were almost fluid, the slight hesitation and drag of his left foot stalling his graceful stalk a reminisce along with that hideous scarring of the iron traps. His face was set and determined, tracking the nightmare as it prowled him in return. A silent battle of wills, who was predator and who was prey. The beast struck first, snapping its large jaws in the place Hiccup was a second before. Hiccup twisted, just barely missing the fangs that stuck out, and tucked a hand under the nightmare's chin attempting to scratch like the others. But the nightmare set itself on fire and Hiccup jerked back with a yelp. He lost his balance and was forced to roll over his shoulder and land crouching. Valka tensed along with Stoic, and Toothless was on his feet. Hiccup hissed, irritated, sticking his hand in his mouth with a glare in the nightmare's direction. The nightmare hissed, looking taunting, and stopped the flames as its tail curled around to take out Hiccup's legs. Hiccup launched himself over the tail, landing on all fours after a roll to disperse the extra momentum, and snapped his omnivore teeth up at the nightmare with obvious annoyance. They exchanged several snaps, bites, pushes and shoves and kicks. Hiccup had a look of concentration on his face, however that didn't stop Stoic's breath catching every time the nightmare came close to clawing or biting his son. Valka's eyes were bright as she watched the exchange. Hiccup had learned, he wasn't using all his energy upon his attacks. Hiccup fumbled over a misplaced weed and sprawled on his front, defenseless. Stoic leapt to his feet as the nightmare pounced. Hiccup only had time to roll onto his back before the nightmare's clawed hand was against his chest, easily caging him in its span and pressing Hiccup into the ground. The nightmare laid down with a realistic battle growl. Valka's staff shot forwards against Stoic's chest. She didn't look at him, her eyes on the fight, but her words were for him: "Don't interfere." Stoic held back more reluctant than the sun on a typical Burke day. Hiccup gripped at the claws pinning him and let out a few frustrated grunts and yells as he kicked uselessly and strained against his cage. The nightmare flattened its claws to apply more pressure onto Hiccup's chest, its toothy mouth almost like a cruel grin. Hiccup's breathing was being impaired by the pressure, but it was the cry stuck between pain and frustration that tugged at Stoic's heart. No further harm was coming to him, the beast was just waiting for Hiccup to give in. But it was hard to watch Hiccup pinned under such a bloodthirsty monster. Valka leaned forwards muttering and panting excitedly. Stoic glanced between her and Hiccup and waited for the next move. Apparently it wasn't over. Hiccup reached to the center of the nightmare's claws and pressed his thumbs into the joint. The nightmare cringed in pain, much like Valka had earlier when Hiccup assaulted her wrist with accurate pressure, but, unlike Valka, the nightmare jerked away out of pained instinct and let Hiccup escape. Hiccup was on his feet at once and threw himself into the nightmare's face, gripping his horns and standing on its nose, shrieking defiantly. Valka stood up with a cheer of approval, Cloudjumper hooting loudly too with his wings spread high. Toothless roared and jumped in place, his claws digging into the earth while he edged between celebrating and protecting. The nightmare glared at the human on his nose. He swung his face from side to try and shake Hiccup off him, but that only made him dizzy. Hiccup was used to being tossed around in gales on Toothless, so this had almost no effect on him. Hiccup roared a few insults to get the creature mad, and, as planned, the nightmare's eyes narrowed and he charged at the wall of the grove, intending to crush Hiccup against the stone. Stoic and Valka both gasped when Hiccup let out a pained yelp at being thrown against the wall so roughly, but his blazing eyes and snarling told the world he wasn't giving up. He placed his feet against the wall and pushed on the nightmare's horns, starting a test of brute strength. The nightmare shoved back, and the moment he did, Hiccup twisted his angle so the nightmare's face was slammed sideways on the ground, Hiccup's strength steering while the nightmare's own force was the killing punch, its horns being held in place by Hiccup's hands. The nightmare went limp at the position of his twisted head on the ground, his fat and forked tongue lolling out of his mouth in shock. Stoic felt astonished all over again as Hiccup backed away as straight as a man. His chest was rising and falling quickly with the recent exercise, and one hand held a surface burn, plus one of his shoulders wasn't being held as high as the other since the blow, but overall he was not seriously harmed. Likely his shoulder was numb from the impact, possibly strained from the shoving he had endured, but since it still functioned as a shoulder, no one was too worried. All around the dragons were roaring and flapping their wings and letting out tongues of flames in honor of Hiccup's victory. Besides Stoic, Valka was roaring and cheering with the crowds of dragons all around her, jumping about like a child. Toothless jumped down to join Hiccup and butted his head into his side. The moment he touched Hiccup's side, the young man dropped to the ground and lay on his back with a long groan. Toothless, had he been human, would have been rolling his eyes. He lay at Hiccup's head and began to pester him with nudges and licks. Hiccup turned away with pretend weakness, but couldn't resist grinning. Valka did roll her eyes as she slid down an offered wing of Cloudjumpers to reach the bottom of the cove. She absently fretted and chuckled as she crouched by his side, lifting his burnt hand to examine it. Her pout was mostly sympathetic as it wasn't that bad. She chattered a question at him with her voice raising in pitch while she pressed several points on his palm. Hiccup barely raised his head before it dropped again. He waved his free hand dismissively. He was fine, just tired. He grinned as his mother lightly messed his bangs with her fingers. She pulled him into a sitting position and jumped over him, literally, to crouch and examine his hurt shoulder. She pressed her palm into it a few times and Hiccup made a half-hearted face at her massage. He muttered softly and Valka flicked his ear, making him cover it and whine. Valka pulled him back into a hug before picking up his wounded hand again for Toothless to look at. Stoic climbed down by himself and approached. By the time he reached the bottom they had changed positions again, with Hiccup leaning against Toothless' chest, letting the dragon lick at his palm and his mother crossed-legged before him. Her eyes were bright and her hands moved as fast as her voice did with its many changes of pitch and tone. The three were humming and chirping and letting out barks and laughter, Hiccup's free hand animatedly gesturing too as they spoke. Valka was excited, and very pleased. It was obvious that she was praising him for every little thing he had done right in the fight. Valka gestured, kissed his forehead, one hand running through his wild hair. Hiccup's smile was peaceful, and happy. His chest puffed in pride. Toothless nuzzled his face and a glance of his green eyes in Stoic's direction alerted the two humans to their visitor. They turned with uncanny timing and their green gazes pierced Stoic where he stood. He stopped moving and they stopped talking. For a moment there was an awkward silence, for him, of no verbal words and no actions. However, judging by their faces, the dragon and two humans were hearing volumes from his stance. Valka smiled and stood for him, obviously making a show about being approachably human since Hiccup and Toothless glanced curiously at her, as if wondering why she was acting this way. Hiccup didn't bother moving to a more human position. He just watched and listened, Toothless' tail coming to rest in his lap and curl around his waist. Hiccup leaned back into him and covered his tail at the fin in response. It was a never-ending cycle of affection, as in response to Hiccup Toothless began to gently nudge and coo at him. Valka smirked at Stoic. Still think Hiccup is a fishbone, she asked, challenged really, but the amusement softened her voice. Hiccup snorted at the word fishbone, he muttered something to Toothless and the dragon briefly growled and protectively pulled Hiccup into his front paws. Hiccup looked up and smiled, and turned his attention to Toothless instead. Either he was disinterested in Stoic's response, or he was feigning it. Toothless took the invitation willingly and rolled his shoulders as if he was bouncing in place, trying to catch Hiccup's locks and ears with his scaly, gummy mouth. Hiccup let him and scratched his jaw back contently with closed eyes. While boy and dragon were enclosed in their own private banter, Stoic answered. The fights were definitely something. Valka's eyebrow raised higher along with the curve of her lips. Stoic barely thought of a similar grin as he reached up and rubbed at his forehead. Hiccup can hold his own, that's certain. He'd be the pride of Berk if he were one of us, he added wistfully. Hiccup turned to him with a dark expression which Toothless quickly removed with a playful pounce. However, Valka knew what Stoic was really trying to say. He was impressed, very much so. Hiccup didn't realize that Stoic considered himself the pride of Berk, at least in fighting ways, and had been called that by others for a very long time. He was acknowledging Hiccup's better fighting abilities. She blinked before smiling. She nodded and partly sauntered up to Cloudjumper. Are you still convinced he wouldn't be able to flatten you? She asked while preening Cloudjumper's head fins. The giant's response was to lean into her arms like an oversized cat, closing his eyes to slits but no further. Stoic hesitated and glanced behind him at Hiccup as he considered the question. Hiccup was faster, stronger, and had a strange gift for bringing pain and weakness with the lightest of touches and a well-placed finger or punch. This unusual skill applied to both dragons and humans, if his earlier confrontation with Valka had been any indication. Size wasn't an issue, obviously. He had taken out a Zipley back and a nightmare. Finally, with the no-harming rule Hiccup and the dragons were mostly abiding by, that left an overhanging promise that Hiccup had been holding back. All things considered, Hiccup was a very worthy opponent. As unassuming as a simple vial, but with a bite as strong as poison. It was his substance, knowledge and precision which made him formidable. It cost Stoic a lot of his pride to acknowledge that against himself he would not stand a chance. When he looked behind, Stoic jumped slightly when he saw Hiccup's attention on him. His eyes more vividly green than they should have been. Stoic absently wondered if the dragons had taught him that, or if it was just the dark clothes he wore that brought them out. Hiccup's expression was stony, and almost cold as he waited for Stoic's response. Stoic took a deep breath and let a real smile tug at his face. Hiccup, his son, was the best fighter he had ever seen. As unorthodox as he was, there was no doubt he was in a league of own. He chuckled gruffly. "I think I'd have quite the fight on my hands," he continued after a moment to judge the reactions of his audience. Hiccup was unmoved, Toothless tilted his head, and Valka smiled smugly. Stoic nodded at her. "I wouldn't go down without a fight, but no doubt it'll be me going down." Hiccup's face was stunned for a moment. Then it morphed into a toothy grin which was the most friendly Stoic had received to date. All the tension ran out of his body and he returned to his normal relaxed state. Toothless purred with the content mood and Hiccup turned his attention back to him. They only looked into each other's eyes, but an entire conversation seemed to be held in that instant. A second later Toothless had pounced upon Hiccup's smaller body and proceeded to roughhouse. Hiccup laughed and let out half-hearted shouts and battle roars as he threw himself into the wrestling, his arms around Toothless' neck and his legs kicking out his feet until he forced Toothless to roll until he was the one pinning, if only for a moment, before Toothless rolled back over and knocked him aside with his wings. Stoic moved out of the way of the wildly flying limbs as they both rolled around like wrestling cubs. Hiccup's smaller body somehow managing to flip, twist and pin the larger reptile as easily as Toothless was in return. At one point Hiccup was gnawing on one of Toothless' ears while clinging to his back, and in the next instant Toothless was dragging Hiccup along on his back by his ankle. Hiccup shrieked in laughter and defiance, and their evenly matched playing continued, no end in sight. Toothless vumphed and crooned and almost laughed with Hiccup to a strange symphony of playing youths. Stoic merely watched with a fond smile. Despite the fact that it was a dragon Hiccup was playing with, the laughter and glee on his face was something he couldn't take his eyes away from. Nor did he try and interrupt. The fight ended eventually when the pushes and shoves devolved into pets and nudges, and the bites and scratches into nips and hugs. Even the playfulness of the wrestling turned into affection, until all that was left was a dragon boy and a night fury more or less cuddling in the grassy, sandy cove. The moment was interrupted when every dragon, and Hiccup, looked up at some silent call. Hiccup tilted his head, Toothless' ears gently fluttered. Cloudjumper looked towards the water at full height, and Valka patiently waited for her dragon to tell her what was going on. Stoic glanced around, every dragon was looking in the same direction. It was undeniably spooky. Then they took flight, letting out calls and making groups before flying away to circle over the water that the ice ceiling held within it. Toothless roared too, his shoulder bumping against Hiccup in excitement as Hiccup eagerly jumped within his crouching position. Stoic looked to Valka. "What's going on?" he asked. Valka swung herself up onto Cloudjumper's neck and smiled. "Feeding time," she answered with a grin. "We're all cooped up in here, we can't go out and hunt for ourselves right now, so the Alpha brings us food." Hiccup and Toothless had already joined the flying dragons when Stoic glanced back at him. Probably eager for a meal. Stoic realized he hadn't seen Hiccup or any of the dragons around here eat anything. He instantly worried that he'd be seeing them eating body parts. He climbed the cove while Cloudjumper and Valka went ahead at his insistence to get their fill. Over 100 grisly images of dragons tearing apart limbs of fellow tribesmen had passed through his head by the halfway point. He felt sick to his empty stomach when he thought of Hiccup with a dragon's appetite. Did he have their demonic desire for human flesh? Odin, he hoped not. When Stoic pulled himself up at last, he saw dragons flying in a flurry around the Alpha's head and body. The Alpha had blocked up the large underwater exit, only his large air bubbles could be seen. Stoic scanned for the streak of black and finally spotted his son. Hiccup was balancing on Toothless' back as they circled above the water, focusing on the murky depth. Valka flew past him, leaning down briefly to hit something out of the water with her staff. Cloudjumper caught it with his teeth and continued his graceful, never-ending glide over the water's surface. Finally Hiccup dove in, Toothless an instant behind him, but not because he was slower, but because if he moved first then Hiccup would fall and maybe hurt himself. The night fury had tamed itself to Hiccup's limits, and Hiccup had become more wild to push those limits. They surfaced a moment later, cutting through the water cleaner than javelins. Hiccup was clinging to Toothless' bare back once again, a grey item in each hand and one in his mouth. Toothless had a mouthful of them, which he quickly swallowed. Stoic watched slightly dumbfounded. Fishing. They were fishing. Around them the many hundreds, and possibly thousands, of other dragons of every species was driving in around them. Ducking their heads, using their tails, spitting fire or sound at the water to stun the fish and gather them leisurely. Were there the bodies? Where were the livestock they stole? The food stores they harassed again and again? He was stuck in his disbelief for quite a few minutes, so long that both Valka and Hiccup landed beside him before he snapped out of it. There were a few more dragons lazily circling, but most were now settled to digest most likely. Hiccup still had a fish in his mouth and two struggling in his hands. He leapt off Toothless and dropped all but the one in his jaw. It was a regular size, about as long as two human palms and on the leaner side. He struggled in his hands, and Hiccup nearly dropped it once. He gripped it harder and glared at it. Stoic chuckled and reached out to help. "Want me to help?" he asked. Hiccup wasn't going to be able to eat these fish while they were alive. He intended to hit the head and messily gut it for him. Hiccup looked up at Stoic blankly and moved to gather his three fish closer to him, lowly growling like a possessive cat over a caught mouse. Stoic realized he must have thought he was trying to take them away. He sighed. "You can have them, but you have to kill them," he tried to explain. Hiccup snorted and rolled his eyes as Valka snickered from sorting her own catch. "I'm not stupid," he snarkily replied, making Stoic jump at the response. It was so human. He sounded like a normal teenager. He held it belly away and tightly at both tail and head in front of him, Toothless watching over his shoulder. His green eyes examined the fish for only a second longer before he jerked forwards and snapped his teeth sharply over the fish's spine. Stoic felt nauseous at the soft crunch that followed. The fish was still and Hiccup dropped it unceremoniously to take out the next one in a similar fashion. Stoic backed away slightly. He watched with his mind empty. That was unexpected. Hiccup held up his fish to Toothless and the beast slurped them up like water. Hiccup turned to his mother and called to her with his chest out in pride, holding his hands away apart to demonstrate his catch. Valka chuckled and returned his pose with a fond look out at their alpha. Hiccup followed her gaze and his eyes softened visibly. His arms rose a little in a self-hug as he watched the white giant surface and survey the nest full of satisfied dragons. Valka was sitting on the grassy bank with Cloudjumper's head hovering just above her shoulder. She had 6 fish in front of her, 3 she set aside using her staff to beat in their heads and the others she gave to Cloudjumper. Valka turned to Toothless and trilled a complex sound which instantly had the Night Fury's ears perking up attentively. He looked at her and purred. Hiccup smiled silently and pressed his back deeper into his chest. Valka and raised a fist to her mouth and breathed out of a wide mouth in a huff, pointing to a patch of earth only a few feet away. Toothless huffed, tossing his head in a dragonish nod before spitting his signature attack onto the patch of earth Valka requested. Stoic jumped away in surprise. Hiccup sniggered openly at his jumpiness. Toothless snorted too. Stoic fought off embarrassment as best he could, straightening his shoulders and grunting to shrug his undignified response off. But it was difficult to retain his dignity when he was being so openly laughed at in the village. No one would dare to laugh at Stoic the Vast, chief of the hooligans of Berk. Here, however, no dragon seemed to care about status. Every being expressed their opinions of another very openly and sincerely. Hiccup was no exception. If he laughed at Stoic, then he found him funny or stupid. If he glared, it was because he disliked him. If he smiled, it was because he approved or liked him. Everything was sincere and unforced. Stoic returned from his thoughts to see Valka propping 3 fish over the scorched bit of earth to cook. She sat back and hummed slightly. "Hungry, Stoic?" she asked. Stoic nodded slightly and took a hesitant seat, glancing at the rest of their company to make sure it was okay. Hiccup didn't care. He was fiddling with his outfit while Toothless had a good scratch beside him. Cloudjumper was friendly, indifferent as always, his size hardly recognizing a weaponless Stoic as a threat to begin with, but keeping his attention away from the smaller being to try and make him feel more comfortable. He was watching the 2 youngers instead. Valka sighed and began to mutter about time food came in. "Curfews are such a pain." Hiccup grunted in agreement, making Valka turn to roll her eyes at him fondly. She chattered and waved a hand in a flyaway after a sharp point in his direction, her head sharply turned away and upwards as her hand dismissively fell. Her voice raising in pitch in the middle of her clicks and huffs and chatters before lowering for the end. Hiccup frowned at her and looked longingly up at the ceiling, and through to the sky beyond. He absently moved his arms as if preparing to take fight, his humming lowering with frustration. He sounded like a trainee who was banned from the ring, Stoic thought. Valka sighed and began a series of clicks and arm flicks that seemed to be her response. Stoic interrupted with a cough. "Why are you under curfew?" he asked. Valka turned her attention to him to explain, Hiccup looking no less annoyed. "There have been sightings of several enemy ships nearby. For our own safety the Alpha ordered us to stay in the nest where he can protect us." He turned one of the fish over and winced when it was thoroughly burnt. "If the ships see any dragon they'll kidnap them and take them for their own purposes. We've rescued too many for that to happen. I shudder to think of what Drago could do if he found us here." Her face was pale. Stoic looked down at the fish and changed the subject. "Why were the dragons fishing?" He, like the rest of his village, assumed that they ate anything, especially livestock and people. Valka looked at him ludicrously. "Fish is the main portion of their diet." Stoic snorted. "What about the livestock and the people they've kidnapped then?" he asked grumpily. Valka got defensive at once. "They don't eat what they steal, something else does," she muttered at the end. Hiccup tensed and shuddered briefly before tucking his head under Toothless' jaw. Toothless hummed, but not in a comforting way, in a way which said, "I'm scared too." Stoic looked up, not sure if he had heard right, and the reactions of his son and his dragon making him curious. "What does?" Valka pretended not to hear him, her anxiously moving hands appearing when she began talking again. "The Alpha gathers the fish for us and brings them here. He's a great leader, he looks after us all very well. No dragon will go hungry tonight." She looked around and smiled as the many contented groans and huffs of dragons filled the air. Stoic glanced around too, feeling slightly better now he wasn't on the menu. He glanced at Valka as she pulled the fish off the scorch mark and examined them. "You haven't been living off fish all these years, have you?" Valka shook her head absently. "No, Hiccup and I often go foraging for nuts and fruits. We need other foods, sometimes we had to steal from local settlements." Her face was slightly troubled. "I only took from those who had a lot, and I'm not proud of it," she added, "but there are some things that I can't get easily, chicken eggs, milk, especially bread." For when Hiccup was little. At the mention of his name Hiccup glanced and smiled at her. Stoic hummed to himself, he couldn't fault Valka for surviving. He spoke his thoughts aloud and she expressed her relief through a smile and a few nervous laughs. "Thank you, Stoic." She held out the fish to him at last. "These are for you." "I haven't done that in a while, so I'm a little out of practice," she sheepishly explained. Stoic looked at the 3 burnt fish and felt a little contentment raise in his chest. It was just like before, she always burnt one thing, and left the last item undercooked out of fear of ruining it too. Yet even the middle one found some way to be barely editable too. He couldn't hold back the slight chuckles. "As long as it's your cooking again," he fondly murmured, taking bites before acknowledging that it wasn't as bad as it looked, if a little bland. Valka blushed a bit and nervously fiddled with her shirt before Cloudjumper nudged her and made a few retching sounds. Toothless soon copied and they spat out 3 fish each. Stoic looked disgusted. "That puts you off your meal," he muttered, still gamely chewing his own batch. Hiccup didn't acknowledge him and picked up the first fish and, with Toothless watching like a mother hen, took a large bite of slimy regurgitated fish. Stoic immediately green. He turned to his wife to take his mind off what he had just seen, only to see Valka wiping her fish off slightly on the grass, but even she tucked in just as eagerly as her son. Hiccup saw Stoic looking queasy and trilled curiously, his face turning to silently inquire. Valka asked on his behalf and Stoic finally managed to spit out, "How can you eat that?" Hiccup looked more confused, and partly annoyed as if Stoic was making a fuss out of nothing. "We always share food like this," he protested, taking another bite absently. Valka nodded. "The fire in the dragons cooks them well, and their saliva has properties which have kept us noticeably resilient to cold and wet. We hardly ever get sick, though." She absently tapped at her chin. "I have noticed that it increases the likeliness of catching eelpox when it's in the vicinity." Hiccup picked up his next fish and turned to his dragon and nodded away, up at a cliff. Toothless crooned his agreement and they shot up to the higher ground. Valka tried not to laugh when Stoic glanced between them and her, silently asking for answers and explanations. Valka called up to Hiccup, reminding him not to wander too far, and said, "I think he was trying to make your meal more appealing by taking his away." Stoic nodded up at Hiccup in appreciation for the gesture, but when he weakly looked at his burnt fish he found that his appetite wasn't the same. He was, however, a little more glad that the dragon's appetite wasn't what he had thought previously. But if that was the case, why were the dragons attacking Berk if not for the food they always stole? Was there another reason? Underscore 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 underscore. Night was falling again. Stoic poked the fire in his temporary house and warily watched the dragons flying around outside. He sighed heavily and looked down at the note he had written for Gobber and the Vikings of Berk, not explaining anything, just in case they thought that he had gone mad, but saying that he was alive and working on making his way back to Berk. It also said to stay clear of Drago Bloodfist, and to fortify in case he came looking for Berk. However, he still needed a way to send his letter. Valka would be back soon. She had gone off somewhere, but when she returned she would know what to do. He had asked Hiccup where she had gone. He had to call up a cliff as the boy was still too wary around him to be on his level alone, but he had sat cross-legged and listened with a respectful attentiveness that had been lacking before. That could only be an improvement. "Where's your mother?" Hiccup tilted his head and then glanced over his shoulder where the Night Fury was scratching his neck against a rock. He chittered briefly at the larger being, and made several hand gestures which Stoic suspected had some meaning. He also stomped a foot and rolled a shoulder. Was he uncomfortable? Toothless ears rose at the question, and he softly barked and cooed an answer. 1. His tail moved up Hiccup's spine like a hand stroking, then going up over his head, messing his hair and landing in his lap where Hiccup began to patiently stroke and scratch, an absently fond expression on his face. Stoic assumed that they had forgotten about him, and was about to ask again when Hiccup spoke. "All champions are patrolling. Curfew may be lifted if my mother and my guardian think we are safe." He looked at Stoic as he spoke, but his hands were never still, massaging and rubbing the tail fin in his lap. Toothless let out several little groans and shivers. If Stoic watched closely he would see the pressure and rotating movements of Hiccup's fingertips change with every noise. A highly fine-tuned method of communication. Stoic nodded, to show he understood, but confusion was written all over his face no doubt. Champion. Guardian, what did that mean? When he had asked Hiccup, young man had frowned as he thought. His hands stilled as he thought very hard, his face falling into a frown of intense concentration. Toothless raised his head to watch and huffed to get his attention after a while. Hiccup looked a bit sulky and muttered something too low for Stoic to make out. "I do not have the Viking words to tell you," he admitted at last. He murmured to his dragon and the dragon offered a few coos back, exhaling so he ruffled Hiccup's hair. Hiccup hummed to himself, "Mother can tell you properly. But Guardian is a protector of a lonely young one, Champion is the chosen point, other defends." "Listen," he explained, but only made Stoic more confused. He had sat himself down and went back to his temporary home to try and carve a brick of wood with a fork. All other sharp weapons were absent. Hiccup had asked if he wanted a claw, but Stoic declined and went back to his struggling, only pausing to watch Hiccup frolicking with the younger dragons and fly from the back of Toothless. Their partnership in flight was something to behold. He couldn't fathom how Hiccup kept his grip and balance through several of their twists and dives. But the happiness on his face and the loud laughter mixed with indignant roars of those they shot past, and the equally overjoyed shrieks of the Night Fury distracted Stoic from his pondering. It didn't matter how. They had done it and were enjoying every second. To an onlooker it was a thing of beauty. Even Stoic was amazed and had spent several long minutes watching the pair. Even though it was Toothless who owned the wings, Hiccup was contributing just as much as the dragon. He leaned, called, looked where Toothless couldn't, used a free hand to grab or knock aside moss or rocks. Hiccup's hands moved in several differently placed grips on the dragon's shoulders and the dragon's wings moved accordingly as if automatically set to a new position, or was it Hiccup's hands moving when the wings urged them to? Same with Hiccup's legs, their grips and positions would move as the dragon urged, or to urge the dragon. Sometimes it seemed one way, the other time it seemed the other party was taking the reins. But it mostly looked as if they were moving in perfect synchronization. More perfect than any machine, instrument, or song. He had left and written his letter when Toothless had flown out of sight. It was a task that couldn't wait any longer. Underscore 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 underscore. Now he was just waiting for Valka. As he absently watched the dragons outside, in the same way he once absently watched the movement of waves on the sea, he noticed a sudden increase of dragons. A sudden stream of entering dragons poured in like seeds out of a split in a woven sack. Valka and her four-winged beast leading the way. He watched her. She waved her staff and shouted in the din, her wood and bone staff never hitting a stray wing, and her voice mingling through the din, through her shell-like blue armor and her horn-crowned mask. Cloudjumper roared too, hovering as the other dragons flew past. The mob of dragons roared back and dispersed in a naturally chaotic way, never getting in each other's way nor crashing. Valka continued to wave her staff and call out, Cloudjumper circling as if to help carry her message, and all around the dragons of the nest began to chatter, move, roar and hum as if discussing. It was loud, yet dispersed. The only quiet happened when the large white dragon king raised his head and sighed deeply, the earth rumbling with his lungs. In the following echoes of silence all the dragons held still. Then they exploded in what could only be described as celebration. They jumped, flew, pounced and wrestled, shouted, roared, howled and tumbled into everyone around them. They flipped in the air, twisted and collided only to raise again unharmed. Tongues of fire lit the sky, making explosions and causing bright flashes and smoke. Stoic saw Valka jumping around on Cloudjumper's back as he soared like the rest. Hiccup soon appeared, standing upright on Toothless as he sped to their elders' sides. Hiccup jumped from Toothless' back and the black dragon caught him and threw him over and over, in flips and flails, in unconcealed glee. Stoic was sure they were laughing, all four of them. The celebrations carried on for a long time, long enough for the awe to wear off. Stoic sat, the only broody soul in the midst of celebration, waiting for his wife and son to explain the situation to him. He was lost in thought and so jumped when Valka appeared beside him, sliding off Cloudjumper's wing to his level, the larger dragon occupying a ledge above, pulling her head free of her mask moments later. Hiccup was still circling overhead with Toothless, crowing and tumbling joyfully. Valka's face was flushed and her chest rose and fell with her deep breaths. The celebrations had exhausted her, but she was smiling widely. She laughed to herself and sat beside him on the log that was laying conveniently. It's been a while since we've had that kind of reaction. She brushed her hands over her skirt absently. Stoic grunted. What's the news? He asked. Valka beamed. Drago's ships have left the area, and the Alpha has lifted the curfew as soon as the storm on the horizon hits. Everyone had been so bored and restless here, to fly free is worth their reaction. She looked up at Hiccup. The boys will be very pleased, they love storm riding. Stoic looked at the dragon and boy who were in an odd formation with the other dragons. Hiccup stood up and let Toothless glide with trust that he wouldn't throw him off balance. His arms spread out and his face tilted upwards towards the sky. It seemed that Hiccup couldn't wait for the upcoming freedom. Where were you today? He asked. Valka was cleaning her helmet with a tuft of pulled grass. Patrolling, that's why we came back with the news. I took several defenders just in case, but there was no need, we're quite safe. Stoic remembered what Hiccup had said earlier. What's a defender? And what's a champion or guardian? Valka looked at him in surprise. How do you know those ranks? She asked. Stoic looked up at Hiccup. Hiccup mentioned them. What do they mean? He asked, giving her his attentions. Valka looked thoughtful. How to explain? She muttered, tapping her finger against her cheek as she sifted through her thoughts. Stoic decided to help. Hiccup said a guardian is a protector, and a champion is a leader, he recalled. Valka nodded absently. Yes, that's partly right, she agreed. She put her helmet down and twisted to face Stoic. A champion is a rank given by the nest to those who've earned it with great deeds. Myself and Cloudjumper are champions. She looked up at her dragon, who was flying with Hiccup and Toothless, the smaller pair flitting around his larger wings comfortably. When I first came to the nest, Cloudjumper had earned his championship by rescuing fellow dragons from the war with Vikings. Before he was a defender, one who willingly puts themselves forward on the front lines of danger to lay down their lives for the Alpha and nest, and all who live there. She smiled. 2. Stoic nodded. So a defender would be a soldier, and a champion the leader of the soldiers, he clarified. Valka nodded. Yes, that's mostly right, it's a little more complicated than that. She went on to explain how the champions were the peacekeepers inside the nest and the ones elevated by other defenders and nest mates as ones worthy of following. They were like mini alphas in a way, problems were taken to them to be sorted, they could command dragons but only if they kept their respect. It was easy to lose. But the longer one was a champion the more likely you'll never lose it. Bottom line, if you didn't have the respect, trust and support of almost the entire nest you wouldn't be a champion any longer. Valka brushed her hair shyly. I earned my championship when I guided a troop of defenders in how to turn away some of Drago's ships, and take out the traps. It was a clean victory and no dragons were lost. She looked over at the alpha. They brought me before the alpha and sang my praises for many nights, and I was named a champion of the nest. Several troops of defenders willingly follow me now. It's a lot of responsibility. She cleared her throat slightly. Because I work closely with Cloudjumper, my brother, we're the second highest authority next to the alpha. We've had to do a lot to earn it. She sighed. Disable traps, free dragon, protect the nest, turn away dangers that get too close, solve internal squabbling, and much more. The freeing of dragons falls to myself and Hiccup mostly. Our hands find it easier than teeth or claws. But because I'm so useful and know so much, I've got the respect needed for most of the dragons to follow my lead. Stoic was slightly awed. His wife was a commander of dragons. They had accepted her as one of their own and given her a high rank in return for her loyalty. It was an oddly political game that he understood well. However. Your brother, he asked. Are you adopted or something? Valka blinked. Oh, she covered her mouth slightly. No, not in that way, it's just an honorific, she explained. A what? Valka rolled her eyes, a little bit of her huffy nature leaking through. A term of respect or affection, or insult. An honorific. I call Cloudjumper brother mine to symbolize our close bond. She twisted her fingers together. There are a few ways to name another dragon with honorifics, but brother mine or sister mine are the highest terms of affection that only rival the terms for a love or a mate. She tilted her head. Sometimes a mate is second to a brother or sister, depending on the individuals, but I think that'll be the case with Toothless and Hiccup if they ever settle down. They're too close for another to come between them, they're practically one person. 3. Stoic looked confused. He took a few mental steps backwards and asked again. Cloudjumper calls you sister. Why? Valka tapped her chin. It'll be easier to explain the degrees first. Valka paused to look up at a group of circling dragons, and waved at them quickly before turning back to Stoic. For biologically related dragons, they refer to each other as kin. For example, you would call your brother Kinspitalut. It's a way of acknowledging them as family. To not is an insult or disowning move. Stoic hummed to himself. It was oddly formal for savage beasts, not that they were showing much savage behavior recently. Valka spoke again once she was sure Stoic understood. For dragons who are especially close as friends, they are called friend formally, or their names are used without any tag to show it is purely them informally, no honorifics. Like you do with Gobber, you don't call him Gobber the Belch every time you speak to him, do you? Stoic shook his head with a small chuckle. He'd never be that formal. Valka shared his laugh. Strangers often refer to each other by what they are, appearance or even species at first. Then upon a forming friendship it becomes less about what and more about who they are. The dragon who names the other first is putting themselves at a higher rank than the second speaker, but rank depends on certain factors: whose home territory it is, size of the flock, age, size of the individuals, individual ranks such as defender or champion, and some others. She thought of it in Viking terms and explained it to him. For example, you would greet a new chief for the first time by full title, like Oswald the Agreeable, and keep up the title of chief when in his village. Stoic nodded. I understand all that, but what's sister or brother got to do with it? He grumbled. Valka muttered something about his impatience before answering him finally. For dragons who are especially close as a pair can be without romantic feelings, and they don't have to be related, they are tagged with brother mine or sister mine. For dragons, brother and sister is like an unshakable best friend, the one who holds all their faith and all their trust, the one they would never betray and never be betrayed by. In a sense they believe themselves to be entirely connected in heart, soul and mind, so they are one but with two physical forms. I believe it best translated into Viking terms as your best sword and your good hand, both work entirely as one, as do brothers and sisters. Stoic rubbed his forehead. As easy as Valka was trying to make it for him, he just wasn't ready for it. He was too old-fashioned, his mind was traditional and his thoughts were not easily changed. Do parents have such unnecessary systems? He growled. Valka nodded her head and rattled on. There is mother, she who births and nurtures them. If she dies or is unable to care for her clutch, another will take her place and be referred to as surrogate, as a name or a tag with her name. There are exceptions to this rule. Sometimes adopted dragons will still call their surrogate just mother if she wins their affections strongly, or if they don't remember their real mother. For example, Toothless calls me mother. She looked very happy at the endearment the black dragon had given her. Stoic raised an eyebrow. Valka saw his look and quickly defended herself. Hiccup and I found him injured in a trap when he was still at the age of dependency on his mother. But she was nowhere to be found. So I took him back to this nest and raised him beside Hiccup. She smiled to herself. At first I was going to find another dragon to raise him after his wings healed, but when they were finally better I had grown too attached to him, and so raised him myself with Hiccup as his adopted kin. Stoic grunted. Why not just find another Night Fury for him? Valka sighed, looking very sad at the question. It may be possible that Toothless is the last of his kind, she confided quietly. Stoic glanced between the black dragon and his sorrowful wife, a little surprised at this revelation. She looked at him with sad eyes. There's nowhere else for him to go, and Night Furies are rare anyway, but Toothless has been the only I've seen since I took him in. Valka used the same tone of voice as if speaking of an orphaned child. Stoic wasn't sure what to feel. He was sad his wife was sad, and the unwilling sympathy that had been growing the longer he stayed around these beasts was feeling a slight pity for Toothless, and yet he also felt some of his old Viking instincts rejoicing that there would soon be one less dragon breed to fight. Valka wiped at her eyes, oblivious to Stoic's inner conflict, and spoke again. There's one more term for a mother, mostly used by the young ones. She checked that Stoic was paying attention before speaking. On a mother figure or ideal female role model will have their name tagged with Na, or matriarch. Quite often a parent is both biological and ideal to the child, in which they won't call anyone matriarch. Stoic thought about it. Would it be like the children calling an elder lady, Miss or Lord, Mr., he asked at last. Valka clapped her hands once and her eyes lightened with respect and impress. Yes, exactly. I was struggling for the right words, she laughed. Stoic felt pleased that he had managed to understand that all on his own. I guess fathers have complicated names too, right? Valka chuckled. Unfortunately for you, she teased. I'll be brief. Sire means the male who impregnated the female and raised the offspring. Guardian means the male who raises the hatchling. Oops, I mean child, she corrected herself, consciously keeping to human terms for Stoic's ease of mind. He smiled at her weakly. Guardian is who raises the child but is not the sire. Finally, patriarch, Orma means a personal male ideal, someone the child aspires to be like, a male dragon, person who holds all the qualities they most admire, she explained. Stoic nodded when he had finally absorbed all this information. Dragons were strangely complicated. So sire is the true father, guardian is the adopted father, and that Manois means ideal male role model, he checked. Valka hummed in agreement. Yes. Stoic's eyes widened in a gut-kicking realization. So Hiccup calls Cloudjumper guardian, he said sadly. Valka winced a little. He was the most constant adult male in his life, it's to be expected. Cloudjumper was quite helpful in raising Hiccup and Toothless, more than you'd expect, she sighs. If he ever finds a mate he'll be a brilliant sire, she smiled fondly, baby four-winged dragons playing through her mind. Stoic was less than pleased. Is Cloudjumper getting between me and Hiccup? Is he stopping him from calling me father? Sire, Valka corrected almost as a reflex, and no, he's not. It's always been clear to Hiccup that Cloudjumper is not his sire, just a parental figure. She leaned back on her hands. I told him from when he was young that his sire was a Viking. He wasn't comfortable with the idea, but Cloudjumper assured him that it wasn't blood that mattered, it was soul, and Hiccup is free to choose who he wishes to be. Stoic wasn't any happier. He glared at the four-winged dragon. For once insanely jealous of a dragon for having Hiccup's parental respect that should rightly belong to him. His next question was out of his mouth before he knew it. Does Hiccup have a patriarch? As soon as he spoke he knew he'd regret it. Valka chuckled. Well, he doesn't call him that anymore, it's considered a little too childish for adolescent. She covered her mouth again as she interrupted herself with a laugh. But he used to call the alpha that. I think the alpha was flattered. She kept laughing. Stoic glanced out at the white giant and grumbled softly. Hiccup couldn't be big or breathe ice. How was that gigantic dragon supposed to represent all Hiccup's most admired qualities? There was nothing Hiccup could imitate and they were nothing alike. Reluctantly, Stoic supposed it was his personality and wise judgment that he was attracted to. Two things Stoic didn't have unless it was Vikings he was dealing with. He curled his hands into fists, frustrated as to how two dragons beat him in his rightful place as his son's father, the human term father. Why did the Alpha and the Four-Wing have to be so special to Hiccup? It made little sense to him. He stood up and Valka's laughter stopped Stoic. She asked worriedly. Stoic sighed deeply in frustration. It's hopeless. Valka silently got to her feet, staff retrieved Stoic. He turned to face her with a deep frown. How am I supposed to become his father if he's already got replacements? He growled. We're nothing alike, and those dragons have everything for Hiccup already. He felt useless and misplaced. Dragons had already taught Hiccup how to fight, survive, fish, interact, cry and laugh. What could Stoic do if he was unwanted and, he slowly realized, unneeded? Valka looked sympathetic. I can't answer that, Stoic. You'll find a way, she smiled slightly. You're too stubborn to give up just like that. Stoic grunted negatively. Valka looked up as their child and his dragon flew overhead. He has your stubbornness too. He's got a Viking's determination that confuses him at times. When all seems hopeless he keeps at it, other dragons giving up, but he won't until he's got what he set out to do. It's an impressive quality, but one that he doesn't have the guidance to deal with. She sent him a smile. Maybe if you both have the same goal you can share that boar-headed stubbornness. Stoic chuckled humorlessly. When are we ever going to agree on anything? He muttered, walking beside Valka as she gestured back to the house. Valka shrugged elegantly. I have no idea, but you'll think of something. In the house Stoic was reminded of his letter. It sat on the table innocently, but it couldn't wait any longer. He picked it up and put a hand on Valka's shoulder as she threw a few more logs on the fire. I need to get this to Burke, he said at last, holding it out for her. Valka read the letter and hummed thoughtfully. Yes. I see. She tapped her staff against the floor, mimicking how a dragon might tap the tip of its tail, as she thought. Eventually she handed the paper back and said, I'll ask Hiccup to leave it where they'll find it. Toothless is the fastest dragon around, and Hiccup's got the only waterproof pouch. Stoic raised an eyebrow. Will he really do me a favor? He asked. Valka nodded, confident. He's been cooped up in here so long he'll leap at the chance to get out of curfew early. Even for this she stepped outside and brought her hands to her mouth. After a deep breath she let out a loud call which sounded like a night fury's. Stoic jumped a little. A moment later there were two answering roars. One devolved into delighted crowing and they soon saw why. Hiccup was dangling from Toothless's front paws, and was being casually tossed up into the air and caught again before he fell too far. Toothless looking like he was having as much fun as Hiccup, his eyes were large and round and his mouth open to let out a series of calls and huffs which sounded similar to tumbling dogs playing. Finally Hiccup was dropped. He landed with a smooth yet awkward side and front roll, on the grassy bank where the waiting adults were. Hiccup still laughing with bright eyes as he waved and stumbled, a little punch-drunk and dizzy, to his feet. He settled into an almost crouch, but stood fully upright when he saw that his mother was. Valka was chuckling, but still pinched his nose and made a few scolding noises when he got close. Hiccup just shrugged, his only human gesture that came naturally besides rolling his eyes, and answered back in a carefree way. Toothless let out a delighted rumble behind him and nudged his head under Hiccup's legs to have the smaller being sit on his back. Stoic got the impression that Hiccup had said something nice about Toothless, judging by the dragon's reaction. Hiccup grinned and hugged Toothless' thick neck tightly as the dragon leaned up to return the hug, both humming happily. Valka shook her head in fond exasperation. What am I going to do with you two? She chuckled, reaching for the letter. Stoic as a favor to ask of you, Hiccup, she said cheerfully. Hiccup glanced up from inspecting Toothless' ears to give Stoic a curious look, his head tilting with a questioning whine. Toothless too, Valka added. Toothless perked up at the sound of his name and also fixed Stoic with a curious expression. Stoic held his letter up. I need this to be taken to Burke, where the men of my village will find it. It will stop them from acting out of line, and coming to find me. Hiccup kept staring at him for a long time, his green eyes boring into Stoic's as if to wheedle out a lie. Toothless lightly sniffed the air and crooned up at Hiccup, looking at him as best he could. Hiccup was quiet, then rumbled too. Hiccup relaxed at last and leaned forwards on Toothless' head to look at the letter, taking it with a gentle hand. So he knew paper was fragile. His eyes scanned over it in every which way he could read. Then he opened up a pouch on his forearm armor and stored it away with surprising delicacy. He looked back up and nodded. Stoic smiled and nodded back, "Thank you." Valka grinned, then snapped her fingers and spoke to them. Her staff moved in a fast gesture. She started a call in high pitch before lowering, only to raise it again at the end. Her free hand twisted to land on her heart, and her final noise was one of worry and sadness. Hiccup's eyes softened visibly, a soft smile on his face. Toothless purred and stepped closer to rear up and lick her cheek. Hiccup leaned forwards after Toothless and kissed her other cheek. Valka looked happy and surprised. Hiccup smiled widely and puffed out his chest, Toothless copying. They both spoke over each other, noises and body gestures too subtle and many for Stoic to begin guessing what they were talking about. Finally Valka conceded. She laughed and patted Toothless' head proudly, and covered Hiccup's heart as soon as she was finished. Hiccup grinned and let of a soft-sounding bark, and Toothless quickly took to the air, leaving the adults staggering in the aftershocks of the strong black wings. Underscore 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 underscore. Flying over Burke wasn't something that Hiccup and Toothless did often. Too dangerous, too close to the Monster Queen's calls, too close to murderers and Imran. However, it wasn't their first time viewing the place. The first time they'd come across it was when a raid was happening, drawn by the noise and fire and light. Once they arrived they had merely circled and observed. They hadn't interacted at all, not to help a fallen dragon nor a dying Viking. They were younger back then, and hadn't seen the true cruelties of war, so it wasn't just detachment which held them back. It was fear, confusion, hate and so much rage. Rage at the evil queen. Rage at the Viking murderers. Rage at the injustice. Since then they had occasionally come back to help the Imran victims, but the sadness of this place, and the rage, brought out Hiccup's bloodlust, and so out of fear of his own nature, his natural ability to engage in war, he and Toothless agreed to avoid Burke unless necessary. Hiccup leaned over the side of Toothless' shoulder to observe the settlement, the Viking's nest, below. It hadn't changed much. There were big wooden buildings, cut and pressed together like individual nests, with the skill and precision of a Whispering Death's nest building skills. There were torches of fire, because they didn't trust their eyes and ears. Also lots of sharp things lying about and hung up for a moment's notice should they wish to engage in war. Noisy, fluffy, grass-eaters dotted the hills and grassy areas around the Viking's nest. Food sources, apparently. Hiccup didn't see how the fluffy things could be tasty. His mother had explained to him that it was the meat inside that they ate. She called it mutton. Hiccup had tried some before, it was okay, but he still didn't see the appeal. It took too long to cook, Toothless had problems coughing it back up for him to eat, and even then it was full of blood which made eating messy and not very tasty. He preferred Icelandic cod. Below were the rock rivers that the Vikings walked around on, not appreciating the terrain of pure earth. There was a water pit in the middle of a large open area, a few fields with growing things. Hiccup had helped himself to several farms all over the Isles in his time. The plants were always tough and tasteless. He leaned his head against Toothless' neck, sighing deeply. Toothless' ear perked. He crooned deeply in his throat, deep and loud enough for Hiccup to feel it in his bones. He smiled as his brother asked, "Concern? Brother mine, you are burdened." Hiccup huffed again and hesitantly answered. He gestured below and then to himself as he shook his head and whined and clicked in confusion, many layers of emotion showing in his voice as Toothless couldn't see his body while they were flying as one. Confusion. I was born in the Viking's nest, but I cannot imagine how I could live as they do. Toothless purred again and flew a little higher to wash fresher air over Hiccup's masked face. It is because brother mine is dragon in your heart. Hiccup smiled into the fresher air. Unconsciously raising his arms to embrace the openness all around him, free, his entire being whispered, not in conversation, but he said it all the same. Hiccup leaned down and nuzzled Toothless' ear through the mask. Love. Thank you, brother mine. He placed a hand under Toothless' chin towards his chest. He couldn't reach his heart, but Toothless knew anyway. Happy. My heart is lighter because of you. Toothless cooed. Happy. Happy when brother mine is happy. Hiccup grinned and leaned back down against Toothless' back. He mused through a hum and a click. Curios. Where to leave the thin Viking marks? Toothless, with his better eyes, looked as they circled yet again. He grunted and nudged to the left. Here. Hiccup looked down and saw the big flatwoods which Vikings liked to pull open and push shut. They were like giant eyelids. Hiccup hummed agreement and Toothless dived seamlessly through the shadows, dodging the reaching light of the torches, and landed on the grass beside the flatwoods in the stone hill. Hiccup pulled out the letter. There wasn't a dragon word for paper, letter or written words, so Hiccup had to call it a very wordy name for others to understand what he was talking about. Toothless was very understanding, other dragons just got confused. Hiccup glanced around and saw a dropped sharp thing, a dagger. He picked it up with reluctance as he got off Toothless and made his stealthy way to the big doors of the Vikings' main hall. Not that Hiccup knew that. He held the paper against the door and stabbed the dagger through the middle. The doors were solid wood, so Hiccup had to lean into the dagger for a moment or so afterwards to ensure that it wouldn't budge until pulled out. He took a step back to admire his handiwork, then dove out of the light and back into the shadows. Toothless wrapped a wing around him at once, sniffing him briefly for signs of harm or fear. Hiccup didn't mind his brothers fussing this once. The Viking nest made him nervous. How could this have been his birthplace? It smelled of death everywhere. Hiccup knew the smell. He had been taught the slight differences in scent for the air, earth and people. His gut instincts also told him, as well as his nose, that this place was covered in fear, and the earth had soaked up more blood than what the Alpha owned in his colossal body. If this place was so uneasy for him, it had to be worse for Toothless. Toothless was immune, in part, to the emotional sides of the nervousness, but his nose caught every death, every species, and even some hints at the various ways creatures met their end. He didn't like this place. It always made Hiccup tremble and nervous. It always made Toothless edgy and he never wanted Hiccup out of his sight. He nudged his smaller brother once more and began insisting on flying away this moment. Hiccup agreed by instantly swinging himself into place. They had to leave, they didn't belong here. Once in the sky and out of sight from the Vikings' nest, they turned their thoughts towards the oncoming storm. The clean and fresh air removed their anxieties. Soon they could feel the static as they flew towards home. Soon they were buzzing in excitement, the static turbulence in the air making their blood race before even the first storm cloud was seen. Hiccup's sounds flew from his mouth so fast there wasn't really a particular noise to describe the string of excitement. Excitement. We shall chase the storm again, brother mine. Ride the lightning, none shall best your speed in the air. Toothless was buzzing too, his legs absently snatching at the air as if to capture the mood, his wings beat harder. Excitement. I shall be faster with brother mine with me. Love. Brother mine inspires my greatest strengths. Hiccup fondly shook his head and lay against Toothless' back, cooing endearments and compliments. Love. Brother Toothless is always strongest, I do not aid your wings, you carry my knowing body and make me free. Pride. Toothless is the best dragon, most dear to my heart. Toothless nudged him back. Love. Sad. Happy. It is Hiccup which makes me so. My heart is stronger with you in it, my heart makes me strong, Hiccup makes me strong. Hiccup softly disagreed and murmured more praise for Toothless. It was one of their oldest games and banters. Each insisting that the other was the stronger one. Hiccup insisted that Toothless was the better one because he could fly, was the fastest, could see and smell and hear as a dragon could, and was still the best even with his dead weight on his back. He was a real dragon. Toothless would disagree and insist that Hiccup's strong heart led him to heal his wings as a young dragon, gave him his flight, so it was only right that he shared. He thought that Hiccup saw, heard and sensed things that dragons were blind to, and that Hiccup made him stronger out of love and inspiration for Hiccup, and out of the determination that Hiccup taught him. Determination which was not dragon-like, but had shaped the two of them so completely. Each disagreed when the other insisted on humbling themselves in favor of promoting the other's greatness. In the end the disagreeing, Loving banter devolved into what it normally did, compliments of themselves as a single entity, loving emotions over their luck to have the other, and warmth. However, their little bubble was broken when the first lightning strike shattered the night in the far distance. It was time. Underscore 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 underscore. The end.